Everybody, tonight as we jump back in our Bible study in the book of Exodus, and tonight we're going to finish chapter 16. We didn't get much of it done last week, but where we are in the Exodus story is we're in the middle of chapter 15, 16, and 17, which is a compilation that seems pretty strategic in showing how God is testing the Israelites once they have left Egypt, which is similar, as has been noted in prior weeks, to our experience as Christians. A lot of times when we come to the faith, God does a lot of abnormal or special things in our life to strengthen our faith, kind of like we see in the plagues and the redemption and the Exodus and the Red Sea crossing. But then there comes a point where God wants to see if we're going to trust Him in what we would call the bad times or the trying times. Because thus far, God has done everything for them. And everything has went well. And so they have this idea that everything is going to continue to go well, and they're not really expecting what they're going to experience in the wilderness. And what the wilderness is designed to do is to teach humans, in this case the Israelites, to depend upon and to trust God and not live by their feelings. And we've already seen in two stories back in chapter 15, we've seen the story where they were very thirsty, right? They're out in the wilderness and it's very hot, it's very intense, the conditions are tough. They are traveling by foot in the masses, and they're thirsty. And so they come to a place and the water is bitter, they can't drink it. And so what do? They complain and they start making assumptions and even accusations about why they've gone out in the wilderness, all of which undermine and defy God's purposes and what He has clearly said the purpose of them coming out in the wilderness is for, and that is to worship God. That doesn't mean that in that worship there won't be difficulty or adversity, right? Because what is really, if you've gone to church here very long, you should know this. What is worship? What is the bottom line of what worship really is? When you break down the word worship in the Hebrew language, it literally means to bow down or do obeisance before, to bow down, literally, face first, before. And so, with that picture in mind, it is, as Doug pointed out, it is worship. It is submission to God Almighty. And that's one thing that should have come easy for the Israelites after they seen Yahweh demonstrate the power that He did in Egypt and their deliverance. But when they get to Marah and they find the bitter water, they choose to complain. God overlooks it at this point because they haven't received the law, so they continue on their way, and they go from adversity to abundance, right? They come to Elim, and in Elim there was an abundance of water and shade. It was a time of rest, relaxation, and relief from the harsh elements. But how many of you know they're not going to stay there, right? And what's important to understand in this whole story is, what are they following? The cloud, which has an equal sign and Yahweh, or the angel Yahweh, that is the presence of God. So God's presence is leading them into adversity. Don't miss that. God Himself is not taken by surprise when He leads them for 3 days and they don't find water, and when they do find water, it's bitter, And it causes God's divine intervention to make the water to where they can drink it and be sustained. God knew that all along. God planned it. So you mean God planned their suffering? How many of you know if you go a couple days without water in intense heat, you're suffering? A loving father would never allow their children to experience hardship or even suffer. Welcome to the Bible. And the greatest dad there has ever been and ever will be, right? God the Father. And He is leading them purposely into hardship to test them, to see whether or not their heart is right. Because it doesn't take faith and it doesn't take trust when God is doing what He was doing in Egypt. And you're just sitting back and watching it unfold, and all of a sudden you're released and you did nothing. But when you get in the wilderness, that's when you find out what's in the hearts of the Israelites. So let's jump back into chapter 16. Because if we don't jump back in, we're not going to finish it this week either. So, verse 1. And they took their journey from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came unto the wilderness of Sin. If you look in the map, it would be somewhere in this area right here. Because we know it's between Shur, which is the wilderness right here, and Mount Sinai, which is somewhere in this region right over here. So it's somewhere up in this vicinity here in the northern Sinai Peninsula, which is between Elim and Sinai on the 15th day of the second month after their departing out of the land of Egypt. So they've been in the wilderness how long? 1 month. Y'all are quicker on the draw this week. Right? And the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. So they're becoming agitated, right? Has anybody ever been like really, really hot and things ain't going well? It's easy to get agitated, right? They're like irritated and agitated, and they're relying on how they feel. They're responding to circumstances and conditions, and that's what God is trying to break them from, right? Which will prove to be a daunting task that even God can accomplish. Selah. Because they never overcome their tendency to complain and refuse to trust God when things get tough. But let's continue. Verse 3, And the children of Israel said unto them, Would to God we had died by the hand of Yahweh in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots, and when we did eat bread to the full. For you have brought us forth into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Now this is the second time since they've left that they've resorted to making accusations against God and against Moses and Aaron in their intentions for bringing them out in the wilderness. And they are longing for what they despised at one time. I want you to think about that. At one point, if we just rewind in this same book, these very same people were begging God to be freed from Egyptian slavery. Begging God. They hated Egypt. They hated slavery. And now things, and let's be real. God is letting them go through some things that are tough, right? And like I said, if you've been there and you've been in this wilderness, you know this is no joke. This is life and death. But how many of you know that God will not allow you to go through more than you're able to withstand and endure and overcome through? Right? That's a promise from God. And so could they do the right thing, refuse to complain, trust God, suck it up, and go through the wilderness in God's timing? Right? 14 months into the land we go. Could they have done that? Would it have been possible? Absolutely. That was God's plan and purpose. But how many of you know God gives us human beings this thing called free will? And He allows us to make choices, and that's the purpose of these tests, to see what choices they will make. God knows ahead of time what choices they will make, but He still puts this before them to test them and to prove what choices they will make, which will show the condition of their hearts. Okay? So they're just like, oh, we should have died in Egypt. Poor us. We have it so hard. We used to sit by the flesh pots and we ate bread to the full. And you brought us to this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Now, again, they would have been hungry. And we laugh, but if most of us were in their shoes, we'd probably be right there on the front row of the complaining committee. Right? Because they would have been very hungry. So verse 4 says, Then said Yahweh to Moses, Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a certain rate every day, that I may prove them, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law, my Torah, my instruction, my teaching, or not. And so God is going to provide, but in the provision, He's also going to test them to see that if in His provision, they'll do what He asked them to do. And so we're going to see God issue a law that will govern them for 40 years while they're in the wilderness. What's interesting about that is this law, this instruction, this command predates what is called the Mosaic Law. Okay? Don't let that trip you up, because the base definition of the word Torah, which is behind this English word law here, is instruction or teaching, right? And so God is testing them to see whether or not they will walk in His instruction. Now I want to digress for just a moment. I want to go to Deuteronomy chapter 8 because it sheds a little more light on what God's doing here. Okay? Are y'all with me? Y'all are like, well, we're not going to get through if you do that, but here we go. This is Moses writing in Deuteronomy just before they will cross over into the land of Canaan, right? They wandered for 40 years, and Moses writes his final words in this book. And this is what is said in chapter 8. We're going to read the entire chapter, because it's important to see the character of God in this. All the commandments which I command you this day shall you observe to do, that you may live. So, in order to live, is it necessary to obey God? Yeah. Has that changed from the old covenant to the new covenant? No. Now, some of the commands have changed, right? Some of how we obey God has changed, because we are no longer under the Mosaic law, but we are under what law as Christians? The law of Christ, which is what? Better said, the teaching of Christ. Okay? So, he said, all the commandments which I command you this day shall you observe to do, that you may live and multiply, and go in and possess the land which the Lord sware unto your fathers. And you shall remember all the way which the Lord your God led you these 40 years in the wilderness. And what was the purpose of the wilderness? He tells us, to humble you, to prove you or to test you, to know what was in your heart. When you get in the middle of adversity and difficulty, you will find out what's in your heart, and so will everybody else. And that was the purpose of the wilderness. Whether you, and this is the furthering the point, whether you would keep his commandments or not. So it kind of seems like keeping God's commandments is kind of a big deal to God, right? Verse 3, and he humbled you and suffered you to hunger. Did you catch that? He humbled you and suffered you to hunger. That's why I chose to read this portion, because he's thinking back on the story that we're investigating. And he fed you with manna, which you knew not, neither did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread only, but how does he live? But by some of the words that proceed out of the mouth of the Lord does man live. I misread that on purpose, right? Did y'all catch that, right? But by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of the Lord does man live. You mean we don't get to pick and choose what we obey and what we don't? You mean God expects us to live up to our understanding of what he expects from us? You think maybe that's why it says somewhere in the New Testament, for him to know to do good and does it not, to him it is sin? Yeah. So, he continues, your raiment waxed not old upon you, neither did your foot swell these 40 years. You shall also consider in your heart that as a man chastens his son or disciplines his son, so the Lord your God chastened you. So suffering and adversity and difficulty is actually God disciplining us as children, or the Israelites in this story. Hebrews talks about this and says that if the Lord isn't chastening you or disciplining you, then you're not his son or his daughter. Therefore, you shall keep the commandments of Yahweh your God, to walk in his ways and to fear him. For Yahweh your God brings you into a good land, a land of brooks, of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills. If you've been to Israel, you've witnessed this with your own eyes. A land of wheat and barley and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of oil, olive, and honey. Back up at the top. A land wherein you shall eat bread without scarceness. You shall not lack anything in it. A land whose stones are iron, and out of whose hills you may dig. It says brass here, but more appropriately, copper. When you have eaten and are full, then you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land which he has given you. Beware that you forget not Yahweh your God in not keeping his commandments, his judgments, his statutes, which I command you this day, lest when you have eaten and are full and have built goodly houses and dwell therein, and when your herds and your flocks multiply, and your silver and your gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then thy heart be lifted up, and you forget Yahweh your God, which brought you forth out of the land of Egypt from the house of bondage, who led you through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions, and drought where there was no water, who brought you forth water out of the rock of flint, who fed you in the wilderness with manna, which your fathers knew not, that he might humble you, and that he might prove you. And here is the purpose, to do you good at the latter end. And you say in your heart, my power and my might of my hand hath gotten me this well. But you shall remember the Lord your God, For it is he that gives you power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant which he sware unto your fathers, as it is this day. And it shall be, if you do at all forget Yahweh your God, and walk after other gods, and serve them, and worship them, I testify against you this day, that you shall surely perish, as the nations which the Lord destroyed before your face, so shall ye perish, because you would not be obedient unto the voice of the Lord your God. So we see in this chapter, as he reflects back on their experiences in the wilderness, all of the testing, all of the difficulty, all of the suffering that God led them through was to bring about their ultimate good and their preparedness to enter into the land of Canaan. Now what's crazy is the generation that left Egypt, they can't even pass the test to be prepared to enter the land. Therefore, what happens to them? They die in the wilderness. We'll get to that in due time. But God is going to, at this point, ignore their complaining. And this is how God is with us as Christians. You come to the faith. You really don't know what to expect. You got a lot of growing up to do, right? You got a lot of bad habits. Your attitude isn't developed like it needs to be. And so God tolerates more in the beginning because you know less. But as you grow in the Lord, he expects more. He kind of backs up and lets you go through some trials to see how you're going to respond. And in that trial, you will prove to yourself where you are in your maturity. And 999 times out of 1,000, we give ourselves far too much credit than we should because we think we're further along than we really are. And then adversity hits and we fall apart and we realize we're about half as tough as we thought we are, right? That's usually how it goes. Well, that's how it's going in this story, right? They're whining and complaining. They're not doing well with the test. And so God is not going to respond to judgment because, they're newbies. We could say, if we were to put this into our situation, they're new converts, right? God has just delivered them, and so God is being tolerant because they don't know what he expects. But here in this story, he's going to test them in a way that he's going to tell them what he expects, and then he's going to see what they do. And he's going to meet their need even though they don't respond to God the way that he would desire them to, which is to ask for bread, not complain and bring forth railing accusations against God and those whom God has chosen. So verse 5, he says, and it shall come to pass that on the 6th day they shall prepare that which they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. And we're going to see the purpose of this. Okay, so back up to verse 4, he said he's going to cause it to rain bread from heaven, and then he's going to give them a certain rate every day, and that he's going to test them to see whether or not they will walk in his instruction or not. But on the 6th day, they're going to gather double. Okay? And this is going to require trust, and we're going to see why as we continue reading. So let's read verse 5 again. It shall come to pass on the 6th day they shall prepare that which they bring in, and it shall be twice as much as they gather daily. So they're going to gather a certain rate, an omer, every day, but on the 6th day, it's going to be double that. Verse 6, and Moses and Aaron said unto all the children of Israel at evening, or Bain Harbine, which literally means at the mixing, which would be, some people would say twilight, but at that time of the day, in the evening, when the day, remember, on a Hebrew calendar, the day begins when? In the evening, right? In the evening and the morning were the first day. And so as the day is as getting ready to close and darkness is setting in, he says right here in verse 6, I'm getting ahead of myself. Verse 6, and Moses and Aaron said unto the children of Israel, at evening, then you shall know that the Lord hath brought you out from the land of Egypt. I'm thinking ahead because he's going to bring quail in the evening. Verse 7, and in the morning, then you shall see the glory of Yahweh, for that he hears your murmurings against Yahweh. And what are we that you murmur against us? So their complaining against Moses and Aaron was really a complaint against God because he's the one behind all of this. But nonetheless, despite their murmuring and complaining, God's going to meet their need and he's going to satisfy their hunger. And he's going to begin in the evening, as we'll see, with flesh or meat. And then every day in the morning, bread from heaven. Okay? Verse 8, and Moses said, this shall be, when Yahweh shall give you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full. For that Yahweh hears your murmurings, which you murmur against him. And what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against the Lord. And Moses spake unto Aaron, say unto all the congregation of the children of Israel, come near before Yahweh, for he has heard your murmurings. So how would they come near before Yahweh? Where is Yahweh? In the cloud, the pillar of fire. So they would approach it, stand before it. Verse 11, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, I have heard your murmurings of the children of Israel. Speak unto them, saying, at evening you will eat flesh, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and you shall know that I am Yahweh, your God. And it came to pass that at evening the quails came up and covered the camp. To this day, quail migrate through the northern Sinai Peninsula every year. Guess which time of the year? This time of the year. And because of their flight, they are extremely tired, and they can actually come up on them and catch them before they're able to fly off. And that's exactly what happens here. So you have quail come up, cover the camp, and in the morning the dew lay round about the host. And when the dew that was lay was gone up, behold, upon the face of the wilderness, or the desert, there lay a small round thing, as small as hoarfrost on the ground. Okay, so this would, if you've ever seen it like a real heavy frost, where it like crystallizes the grass, right? You have the little crystallization on vegetation and things like that. That's what the appearance of it looked like when the dew was gone up. In verse 15, and when the children of Israel saw it, they said one to another. The King James says it is manna, but literally in Hebrew it says manhu, which could be in a question. What is it? Because the Hebrew word for what is ma, but it has a noon prefix to the end, which is not uncommon in Hebrew to add a noon to the end of a word to add emphasis to it. So, you know, it could go either way. It is what, right? They're doing a word play on the Hebrew word, which means what? Like, because they don't know what it is. What is this, right? The dew is gone, and what is this little crystal-looking stuff that's left over? Where did it come from? What is it? We've never seen it before, right? And so, what is it? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said unto them, This is the bread which the Lord has given you to eat. This is the thing which Yahweh has commanded. Gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man according to the number of your persons. Take ye every man for them which are in his tent. So they all receive the same portion, right? An omer. This is one of the convenient things about Logos, in case you don't know some of these terms, like an omer. What is an omer? You can look here and it will give you right here, it's about 1/3 of a gallon, or 1.5 to upwards of 2 liters is how much an omer is. And so that's what they would gather daily. Every person would gather or have that much available to them. Verse 17, and the children of Israel did so, and gathered, some more, some less. Right? Obviously, some would be more capable to gather more than others. But watch what happens in verse 18. And when they did meet it with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing over, and he that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. So what's going on here? Equality. Equality. Everyone is going to get an omer regardless of what they gather. Where is this duplicated in the New Testament? No. In the early church, in the book of Acts, they duplicate this in principle when those who have more sell what they have and bring it to the apostles, and distribution is made to where everyone has what they need. And this verse is actually referenced there in that situation. Okay? So there's equality. No one will do without. Everyone will have the same. Y'all following me? Verse 19, Moses said, Let no man leave of it till the morning, or which would be the next day. Notwithstanding, they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left it until the morning, and it bred worms and stank, and Moses was wroth with them. So Moses says, all right, here's how this is going to work, guys. This is going to happen every day. Don't worry about it. God said it's going to happen. It's a guarantee. You'll have an omer apiece every single day. But every single day, but the Sabbath day, that is, you're going to get up and you're going to gather an omer, except the 6th day, you're going to gather 2. Right? And any day, any normal day, that you leave over what you do not eat, saving it for the next day because you don't trust that God's going to provide for you the next day, it's going to decay. It's going to spoil. It's going to be no good. So eat your daily portion and know that tomorrow God will provide. So no hoarding. Right? But some of them said, you know what? I've been kind of hungry. I might save some of this and think in case things get tough, in case God kind of backs out on his word or something. So they test Moses, and Moses gets angry about it. Verse 21, and they gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating. And when the sun waxed hot, it melted. So they had a limited time. They had to get up and get out of bed and get their food for the day. Right? Because when the sun waxed hot, it would melt. And it came to pass that on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. So that first day before the Sabbath rolls around, right? The 6th day. And they gather a double portion, and they tell Moses. In verse 23, and he said unto them, this is that which the Lord hath said, tomorrow is the rest, the Shabbat of the holy Shabbat unto Yahweh. Bake what you will bake today, and seethe or boil or cook. Usually this particular word, bashal, means to boil. Cook that you will cook, and that which remains over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. So any other day, if they did that, what would happen? It would spoil. But on this day, it would supernaturally be preserved, because on the 7th day, you can go check, but there's not going to be manna, because on the 7th day, God ceases from providing manna. Why would God choose to do this? Because this is taken from what we see in the very beginning of the book of Genesis, where it's hearkening back to the creation account, where God created this inhabitable world in 6 days, and on the 7th day he ceased from his creative work. And so this is the first time in the Hebrew Old Testament that the Sabbath day is mentioned, apart from the 2 mentionings in the creation story itself. So 2,500 plus years has gone by as far as human history, and what we have read about in Genesis, and other than in the creation story, the Sabbath day being a day that is to be observed by humans is never mentioned until this story. Which is interesting, because this story predates the giving of the Mosaic Law, obviously, right? So God is actually instituting the keeping of the Sabbath day right here. He will elaborate on what all that entails at Sinai when he gives the bulk of the Mosaic Law. But here he is instituting the principle of keeping the Sabbath. Now, why would God want us, or want the Israelites to keep the Sabbath? It's real easy. You ready for this? You might want to get your pencil out. Because God wants us to be like him. Or God wanted the Israelites in this story to be like himself. He worked 6 days and ceased on the 7th day, and he wanted his people to be identified with himself by doing what he himself had done. Real simple. So he's setting forth a paradigm that they're to walk in, which is something he had done himself. So what would be the paradigm for us as Christians under the new covenant? I'm looking for one word. And we just did a series in 1 Corinthians. I'll give you another hint. What's the paradigm? The cross. The cross. And what does the cross represent? Self-sacrifice. That's what we're called to as Christians, is sacrificing of ourselves for God's purpose. Isn't that what Jesus did? And who are we supposed to imitate? Right? Jesus. We're supposed to walk in his footsteps. We're supposed to follow him. We are supposed to pick up our cross and follow him, right? Because the cross is the paradigm. It is the way that we are to live our lives. Same things happening here in the Old Testament. What will set us apart as Christians is when we follow the paradigm that Jesus set forth in him carrying his own cross. Just like for the Israelites, what would have set them apart from other people groups in the known world, in the ancient Near East, is that on the seventh day, every week, come hell or high water, there's no work going on. They're ceasing. They're resting. They're Shabbating. And they have already made provision while they're in the wilderness. God has made provision that on the sixth day, they will gather twice as much, and they can cook it and lay it up for the next day, and that is the only day that it will not spoil, which shows God's supernatural hand in all of this, and the fact that they're going to have to trust that that's how it will be. So you have this one group who tries to lay some up, right, for the next day, and it spoils. I wonder what they're going to do on the sixth day. That same group is probably going to be disobedient in that moment too. They're going to test God then too, right? So let's see what happens. Verse 24. And they laid it up till the morning as Moses bade, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm therein. You mean God tells the truth? And Moses said, eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today you shall not find it in the field. Now they probably took God at his word and didn't even bother going out to check, right? Watch what's said, verse 26. 6 days shall you gather it. But on the seventh day, which is the Shabbat, in it there shall be none. Which again explains any naturalistic reasoning for what this is, as has been proposed by many throughout the years, because one day a week, you're not going to find it. So if this is a natural phenomena, like some people propose that out in the wilderness there's these insects who have this excrement that you can actually read about this. They put forth this excrement that crystallizes, and even when it gets hot, it kind of melts away. But if you get it in the morning, it's edible, and it's kind of got a sweet flavor, and the Bedouins still use it to this day, and some have proposed that this is what it was. It's the same thing that the Bedouins eat to this day. But how do you explain the fact that God said it was coming from him, and it's missing on the seventh day? I mean, did God send an email to the insects and tell them, hey, on the seventh day, don't give any excrement to feed the Israelites? It just doesn't make sense, does it? But you can actually, I'll include something in our Facebook group. You can read on it because it's interesting at least. So, verse 27. And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day together, and they found none. So they're going to try him at every angle, right? And the Lord said unto Moses, how long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? Like there's so many of them at this point, right? The ones that he's actually given them, they won't even obey. And he's fixing to take them to Sinai and give them a whole lot more, right? 600 plus more. And they can't even keep the first one he gives them. How many of you know that's not a good indication of what's to come? Verse 29, see, for that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, he gives you on the sixth day the bread of 2 days. Abide every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. And he's talking about together the manna. So the people rested on the seventh day. And the house of Israel called the name thereof manna, or man in Hebrew. And it kind of describes it. It was like coriander seed, white. And the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. So it had a sweetness to it. It also describes it in the book of Numbers. And Moses said, "This is the thing which the Lord commands. Fill an omer of it to be kept for your generations, that they may see the bread wherewith I have fed you in the wilderness when I brought you forth from the land of Egypt." And watch what happens here, because this is very interesting. And Moses said unto Aaron, "Take a pot and put an omer full of manna therein, and lay it up before the Lord to be kept for your generations." So it won't even last a day throughout the week. The day before the Sabbath, it'll last 2 days. But here it is commanded that they take an omer of it that will be kept for generations, as evidence of God's provision in the wilderness in generations to come. It's kind of hard to explain that naturally, especially if it's insect gook, right? So, verse 34, this is where we're going to get into a little bit of discussion. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron laid it up before the testimony to be kept. Wait a minute. What's the testimony? What is the testimony? Is there anything called the testimony? There are 2 things called the testimony in the Old Testament, especially in the Exodus story. And obviously we haven't gotten to that yet, but I know you know the answer. The Ark of the Testimony, or the Ark of the Testament, right? Or the Ark of the Covenant. Those are the 2 names for it. But what else is called the testimony? The tablets. The 10 Commandments. The Decalogue, which is yet to happen. Which is why I'm making a big deal of this. Because if they haven't made it to Sinai, and they have not built the Ark of the Testimony, it's called the Ark of the Testimony because it bears the testimony of God, which is the tablets, which represent His law. If they haven't even, right, they're a month into their journey. They're not even, they're over a month away from Sinai. God hasn't even told them there will be an Ark of the Testimony. So how is it said here in verse 34 that Aaron laid it before the testimony to be kept? What obviously had to have happened here chronologically? Verse 34 had to have been written at a later time after they had the Ark of the Covenant made and constructed and available for use. Then that omer full of manna was then placed before it, as we see here. But it gets even more interesting when we read the next verse. And this is important because there's so much being discussed about the authorship of the Torah right now. Okay? And you need to be on your toes because you're going to be challenged, especially in the coming years, regarding things like this. And you need to be ready because Peter says it's our obligation as Christians to give a defense for the hope in which we believe, the faith in which we defend. It's called apologetics. Verse 35. And the children of Israel did eat manna 40 years. until they came into a land inhabited, they did eat manna, until they came unto the borders of the land of Canaan. What's the problem with that verse? First of all, it's fast forwarding from this story 40 plus years. And second, and more importantly, Moses could not have written this verse. Because Moses died at Mount Nebo, having never crossed in to the land of Canaan, and having never seen a day in which the manna had ceased. So you can read about when it actually ceases, I think, in Joshua chapter 5. I encourage you to do that. Because it's quite obvious that when Joshua 5 takes place, Moses has been gone for a while at that point. How many of you know a dead man can't write anything? Right? And he didn't write this ahead of time, knowing what was going to happen. This is the case where you have minor editing by a later scribe. And if I had to guess who would be that particular scribe who would have added this, I would say Joshua. Because Joshua was trained and served beside Moses for 40 years in the wilderness. And if there was anyone qualified to add, an editorial comment like this, it would be himself. And then in verse 36, we have another odd happening. It says, there's this explanation. Now an omer is the 10th part of an ephah. Why is that odd? It's like oddly placed, for one thing, right? But what does that tell us about an omer in this statement? It's no longer a measure that is being used. Therefore, it has to be explained. Do you think that those who gathered the omer every day needed it to be explained to them or their children how much an omer was? No. But generations passing and them moving into the land of Canaan, and this word ceasing to be used as a unit for measure, then would it have to be explained how much that would be? Yes. So clearly this was added also at a later time, explaining how much exactly they gathered every day. There is no way Moses would have written that, because he would not have needed to. So pretty much you can say verses 35 and 36 for sure he didn't write, and possibly not even verse 34. He could have written verse 34 at the end of the 40 years, looking back to what had taken place after they constructed the ark after Sinai. But it makes sense that verses 34 through 36 were added by a scribe later on, explaining things related to this story as far as the manna, how it's preserved, how it was kept in the Ark of the Covenant, and then the unit of measure that was used. Okay? Which tells us that if they had to explain the omer as a measure of volume, the audience that receives verse 36 probably no longer had what available to see? The Ark of the Covenant, or the tablets, or the manna, or Aaron's rod, which tells us this was probably added after what major event in Israelite history? The Babylonian exile, the destruction of Solomon's temple. So you're talking about a late addition to this text. The exile took place when? Y'all are like, you should have asked at the first part of this, right? 587 BC. 587 BC. The Babylonians invaded Jerusalem and took them captive for 70 years. All right, any questions? Remember?
Would it have been normal for them to have only eaten twice a day? Because they only referenced the bread in the morning and then the meat at night.
Yes, they would have eaten a lot less and a lot less often than we do today. Something that I didn't point out in this story, the quail coming in the evening was not an everyday occurrence. Okay, it happens here and it will happen again in Numbers. But as far as what they ate every day, it was the manna is what they ate every day. The quail was just here in another incident that we'll read in Numbers. They didn't get quail every day. Gary?
If the scribe is going to bother to add the new language of what an omer is, why wouldn't they just go into the body and replace that everywhere it says omer with that information? Why add it in such a random at the very end?
They don't like to take away from the text. You'd rather add an editorial comment than to change the text. But they do that on occasions with like the updating of location place names.
So you think when you say the term editorial comment, I mean, we're gathering that it was now, but would it have been known then as an editorial comment? I mean, it would have been something that...
That's the point of the editorial comment. It was necessary for them to even understand what an omer was because they're living at a time where they used an ephah as a measurement. So they're saying, hey, this is how an omer relates to an ephah, which is the measurement that they were using at the time of verse 36.
Got it.
Make sense?
Yep.
Amber?
I have a couple more. On the manna, I'm assuming it's a grain-like substance that they would have to grind and then make bread out of. Because if it's small, that's what something Trent was asking.
But it can also be eaten in the state that it's gathered too.
Okay.
But it obviously has an effect like grain where it can produce more if you bake it or cook it or whatever they did with it.
When you were talking about the Sabbath, that calls back creation to their minds. And we talked about previously that the judgments, the plagues on Egypt was viewed sort of, or could be viewed sort of like a decreation.
Yes, creation reversal.
So there's decreation going on there, and then recreation happening here. Would this have been like blaringly obvious to Israelites to see God's doing these things and kind of following that pattern, and then here you've got him instituting the Sabbath, which would call their mind? Wouldn't that be just...
I don't think it would be as obvious to them as we would think, because it seems obvious to us because we've read Genesis. Well, Moses hasn't even written Genesis at this point, and so some of them may have heard stories of creation, but we'd have to assume that. We really don't know, because the creation story is only written when Moses finally writes it, and that's from Sinai forward. So there's nothing written down that they would have known or seen or read or heard that would even tie any of this to creation. This is kind of a vantage point that we have because we have the whole of the text. We can look at Genesis, we can look at Exodus, and we can be like, aha, that's what hindsight does. Unfortunately, they don't have that at the time this is all happening.
I just didn't know how strong or if we knew how strong their oral tradition was. So if they would have been kind of making these connections as it was happening.
They were a very strong oral tradition society, but as slaves, how privy they would have been to learning and knowing those traditions, I don't think anyone could say with certainty how much they would have known or not known. Any other questions? One more? Okay.
On the Sabbath, it talks about they're each to stay in his place. Is that meaning they are not to leave their tent for the duration of the day, or just in reference to going and gathering?
It's in reference to gathering the manna, not that they would be like strictly confined to their tent, you know, because
I know later they came up with so many rules. You can't walk so far and you can't do so much.
a lot of those rules that they come up with in the halakha are related to how they interpreted this passage and others related to the Sabbath. But they read too far and took too much liberty in the restrictions that they placed, obviously, as we see in the Gospels. Gary?
This may be at the risk of sounding really stupid, and it may have been explained later, but I'm just not having memory of it. When the Israelites left, they took with them all the spoils of Egypt, which include animals and all that type of stuff. So nowhere along the way does it say that, oops, we ate the last one, we forgot to, save a calf. So where are all the animals?
That's an awesome question. I was waiting for someone to ask that, because we know they left with herds and livestock and possessions from Egypt. They still have them. So if they would have gotten hungry enough, they could have done something. But when they're out in the wilderness and they're hungry, guess what else is hungry? The livestock are suffering as well.
So we assume that they're not being provided for also supernaturally?
They're not like at the forefront of importance in this story, so I mean we're guessing, man. They had animals. They could have eaten them if they wanted to, obviously. Man, it's silent on that. That's a good question, though. I mean, if you got hungry, kill a cow, crying out loud. But it wouldn't take long for them to go through it, because they had no way of preserving it. So what they kill, they would have to devour.
But there still should be multiplication going on with males and female animals.
But if they're starving,
I don't know if they're in distress. And
animals definitely dying off.
Yeah.
People are starving. I mean, there's no water.
But we have to speculate that, right?
I bet the animals ate the manna just like the people ate.
that's what
I mean, look at all the cracker factories and everything else around there that farmers go and they get all the waste and their animals do good on it. But
if it's a grain.
I don't know.
questions you can't answer.
I overlooked cows searching for manna every day and getting an omer full. I don't know.
Did they touch on that in the documentary about the types of herds and how far they could go? Was that in that documentary?
Yeah, they
When
talked
were
about.
talking about the distance. They talked
Yeah.
about them being that they could be pretty hardy.
But they were talking about how they could make the trip, but they would be suffering.
Yeah, they wouldn't be in friendship.
Yeah, because they wouldn't be sustained. So I don't know. It's silent on all of that, but that is a great question that I'm surprised didn't come up even last week.
Yeah. I was asleep.
Question.
Doug?
He tells them that on the sixth day together twice as much. So he's having them to rest. He's having them to rest after they worked a week or 6 days. And yet, we take our rest before we work our, the way that most of America does the Sunday instead of the Saturday. And so you wonder sometimes we don't have the same attitude that seems like we've always got. We want the good up front. We want the rest up front. very few people really rest anyway. But instead of doing it at the end of the week, we do it the first time. Is that big a deal?
Obviously, Sabbath observance is not a New Testament command for Christians. So, there's a reason it's not. Because we're no longer following the paradigm of Yahweh of the Old Testament, who is the Yahweh of creation. We are following the paradigm of Christ. And there are actually some Sabbath day controversies in the Gospels where Jesus, of all people, who would be most qualified to explain the purpose of the Sabbath, explains it as being for man, to serve a purpose for man, not for man to serve the Sabbath. And perhaps that's why it didn't carry over into the New Testament as a command, because they had perverted it and manipulated its usage so much by the first century during Jesus' day that he done away with that as a command to be observed. But regardless, it is not a command for the church to keep the Sabbath. So, should we observe a day a week of rest? I think that is a principle that should be observed. And I think if we don't observe that principle, we'll suffer. But there is no New Testament command of keeping the Sabbath. There certainly is not a command to worship on the Sabbath, or go to church on the Sabbath. There's actually not a command in the Bible that even told the Israelites to go to church on the Sabbath. So that's like a big can of worms, right? It's amazing what people believe that's not in the Bible. But it's a day of ceasing and reflection. Because when you cease and reflect, you'll be thankful. And gratitude sets the tone for the coming week. And it makes you feel like you've accomplished something.
This
Amber?
might be sidebar, but I listened to a podcast on the Sabbath, seventh day rest from the Bible Project, and they were talking about that specifically in this time, emphasizing your reliance upon Yahweh. You are not self-sufficient. It doesn't matter how much you work, it doesn't matter what you do. When you put everything aside and you devote that one day to Yahweh, then you are not becoming your own God intentionally. By design, you are placing Him first, and your gratitude in Him that day is just supposed to be devoted to the Lord, because otherwise you're always working and doing all these things, and it's easy to rely on yourself, like they were saying in Deuteronomy 8. You start looking at all you have and thinking, oh yeah, I earned this, I did it. So they were talking about how that principle was there to kind of mentally keep you in check, to keep Yahweh number one. Yep.
Good point. They also not only had the Sabbath, the weekly Sabbath, they had the Shemitah, which is every seventh year, was a year they didn't plant. And God would provide on the sixth year for the seventh year. They would take a whole year to let the land rest. And then every 49 years, on the 50th year, was the Yovel, the year of Jubilee, where they would release or cancel all debts. And that was really a hard test. Because if someone came to you and wanted to borrow money on the 49th year, Yahweh said, you better do it.
Yeah.
And you better not have a hard heart and think within your heart, well, the Jubilee's coming here in 6 months. I ain't going to loan them money because they're only going to pay me for 6 months and then be released to their debt. He said, you better do it. Because he didn't want them becoming, as she said, self-reliant, self-sustaining, and thinking that it was their own strength and their own power. And it really took faith to trust God in each of these series of 7 that God established to govern the people of Israel. Doug?
Mary, Kim folks was in that Shemitah because they must have canned for the 7th year.
She cans constant.
Any other questions, guys? All right.